On the 11th day of November in 1918, the deafening roar of artillery finally ceased across the Western Front. A sudden and haunting silence descended upon the muddy trenches, signaling that the Great War had finally come to an end. Victorious crowds flooded into Trafalgar Square, dancing with wild abandon to celebrate the triumph of democracy over Prussian militarism. Above them, the Union Jack fluttered proudly, representing the largest empire in human history that still covered a quarter of the globe. To the outside observer, Great Britain appeared as a mighty colossus, remaining the undisputed master of the global political order. Yet, behind the heavy oak doors of the Treasury and Whitehall, the mood was somber, devoid of any celebratory spirit. The grim men who viewed the nation solely through ledgers and balance sheets were burdened by a terrifying financial secret. They understood that this monumental victory had completely bankrupted the victor, leaving the nation's coffers dangerously empty and depleted. Britain had waged the conflict on a scale of expense that was previously unimaginable to the conservative Victorian mind. To finance the sprawling armies and vast fleets needed to defeat Germany, the government burned through enormous national reserves. They had ruthlessly liquidated foreign investments, selling off railways in Argentina and profitable mines in Africa to stay afloat. This national fire sale was necessary to pay for endless shipments of American steel and vast quantities of Canadian wheat. When those accumulated reserves finally ran dry, the British government turned to desperate borrowing on an unprecedented global scale. The nation ended the war drowning in a sea of red ink, with the national debt exploding exponentially. The debt had surged from roughly £600 million in 1914 to £7 billion by 1980. Crucially, a significant portion of this crushing obligation was owed to the United States and required repayment in dollars. The Britain that emerged from the trenches in 1919 was a fundamentally different economic animal than the pre-war nation. Before the conflict began, London was the world's banker, and Britain stood tall as the planet's supreme creditor nation. Now, after 4 years of total war, the empire had been reduced to a struggling debtor dependent on foreign loan. Before the war, British industry had dominated global trade, but the conflict had allowed fierce new competitors to rise. While British factories were busy churning out artillery shells, aggressive American and Japanese competitors stole their export markets. The engine of the British economy, once the envy of the world, was now sputtering and failing to start. Its core industries of coal mining, shipbuilding, and steel production in the north were dangerously outdated and neglected. These heavy industries were bloated, inefficient, and technologically backward compared to their sleek and modern new international rivals. But the stubborn British elite, politicians in Westminster, and bankers in the city refused to accept this reality. They viewed the catastrophic economic damage of the war not as a permanent shift, but as a temporary aberration. They believed that with peace restored, the natural order would reassert itself with London at the financial centre. There was a desperate, almost psychological hunger among the ruling class to return to the comfort of pre-war normalcy. For the British establishment, this concept of normalcy meant one thing above all else: the return of the gold standard. For nearly a century before the war, the gold standard had been the heavy anchor of the global economy. It was a rigid system of fixed exchange rates where every major currency was pegged to a specific amount of gold. A citizen could walk into the Bank of England with a paper note and demand 5 gold sovereigns in exchange. Because the British pound was considered as good as gold, it became the world's most trusted reserve currency. Global trade was conducted in sterling, and loans from Tokyo to Rio were priced in the British pound. This financial dominance was the invisible bedrock that supported the vast weight of British imperial power. It allowed a small, rainy island in the North Atlantic to punch far above its weight in global affairs. When the war started in 1914, Britain had effectively suspended the gold standard out of sheer necessity. They needed to print vast sums of money to pay soldiers and buy munitions for the front line. The government printed far more paper money than they had gold in the vaults to back it up. They severed the link between the paper pound and the metal, and the result was predictable and rapid inflation. During the war years, prices across Britain more than doubled as the invisible thief of inflation eroded savings. The value of the paper pound, now floating freely on global markets, began to sink rapidly against the American dollar. While the pound fluctuated wildly, the dollar remained rock solid, securely backed by the vast gold reserves of America. By 1919, the pound, worth $4.86 before the war, was trading as low as $3.40. To the proud men holding the levers of power in London, this depreciation was nothing short of a national humiliation. In their worldview, a weak currency meant a weak nation, a visible scar of decline for all to see. It was interpreted as a distress signal to the world that Great Britain was slowly fading into second-rate status. They viewed the devaluation not as a necessary economic adjustment to a new reality, but as a profound moral failure. It was seen as a form of default, a shameful betrayal of everyone who had ever trusted in British financial integrity. Over the last century, a universal consensus had formed among the elite, the politicians, and the powerful Treasury officials. Leading this charge was the imperious governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, a man of rigid determination. The overriding priority was not just to return to gold, but to do so at the exact pre-war rate. They were determined to turn back the hands of the clock and erase the economic consequences of the conflict. They wanted the pound to be worth $4.86 again, regardless of the cost to the nation. They desperately wanted to pretend that the economic devastation of the last 4 catastrophic years had simply never happened. This fateful decision was driven by pride, deep nostalgia, and a desperate desire to maintain status against New York. They believed that if they could just fix the currency symbol, trade, industry, and prosperity would magically fall into place. They did not understand that the world had changed irrevocably and that the old map no longer matched the territory. America was now the undisputed financial powerhouse of the world, hoarding the vast majority of the global gold supply. British industry was no longer competitive enough to support such a strong currency without inflicting massive internal damage. To force the pound back up to its pre-war value required a massive and painful economic adjustment. The government decided to engineer a brutal deflation, deliberately depressing the economy to forcefully lower prices. They had to make money scarce and expensive, forcing down wages across the entire nation to compete. It was a policy of deliberate economic strangulation, undertaken in the belief that pain was necessary medicine. The government prepared to put the British economy into a straitjacket crafted from solid gold. They were about to sacrifice the real economy of factories and workers on the altar of financial prestige. To execute this return, the Bank of England raised interest rates, restricting the flow of vital credit. Simultaneously, the Treasury slashed government spending, ruthlessly cutting back on housing and vital social programs. The goal was to squeeze the economy until prices dropped enough to support the old exchange rate. It was a form of economic anorexia, where the country tried to starve itself back into shape. By the early 20s, this policy was already inflicting deep and festering wounds on the nation. While bankers in the City of London applauded the strengthening currency, the industrial heartlands were bleeding out. In the coal mines of Wales and shipyards of Glasgow, the order books were drying up completely. Businesses found that as the pound got stronger, their goods became impossibly expensive for foreign buyers. A ton of British steel became significantly costlier than French steel, purely because of the currency shift. British industry, already struggling with outdated machinery, was being priced out of the global market by its own government. Unemployment began to climb relentlessly, with over 1.5 million men soon out of work. The homes fit for heroes that had been promised to returning soldiers quickly became slums of despair. In 1924, the final act of this tragedy began with a surprising political appointment. Winston Churchill was named Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man seeking a legacy but ignorant of economics. Upon arriving at the Treasury, Churchill was immediately surrounded by the high priests of finance who whispered seductive promises. Montague, Norman, and top civil servants told him it was his destiny to be the savior who restored Britain's honor. They insisted that returning to the gold standard was the only way to banish inflation and reclaim London's global throne. But Churchill had deep doubts. He was not a banker, but a man who had seen the trenches and feared social unrest. In private memos, he famously questioned why the interests of finance should override the vital interests of the industrial worker. He wrote that he would rather see finance less proud and industry more content, a sentiment that terrified his advisers. To resolve his internal conflict, Churchill hosted a dinner party, inviting both the bankers and their fiercest critic, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes, already a rock star of economics, laid out a devastating argument that the pre-war exchange rate was a dangerous fantasy. He explained that based on production costs, the pound was actually worth 10% less than the bankers claimed. Keynes warned that forcing the pound back to 4.86 would artificially overvalue the currency by 10%. This meant every British exporter would effectively be slapped with a 10% tax on goods sold abroad. Conversely, every foreign importer selling goods into Britain would essentially receive a 10% subsidy from the government. To remain competitive, British companies would be forced to cut their costs by 10%, which inevitably meant cutting wages. Keynes looked Churchill in the eye and warned that this policy was a declaration of war on the working class. He predicted it would lead to strikes, social chaos, and the deliberate destruction of British industry for a symbol. Churchill listened intently, but the combined weight of the establishment and the City of London was too heavy to resist. They appealed to his vanity and patriotism, warning that without gold, the United States would permanently eclipse the British Empire. Churchill caved, choosing the advice of the bankers over the economist, and the past over the future. On April 28, 1925, Churchill stood in the House of Commons and announced the return to the gold standard. He declared that gold would shackle them to reality, and the House erupted in cheers while the markets rejoiced. But outside the insular bubble of Westminster, the harsh reality Churchill spoke of struck immediately and with devastating force. The golden straitjacket had been firmly locked onto the British economy, and the key was promptly thrown away. Almost instantly, the price of British coal in international markets jumped, making it uncompetitive overnight. Foreign buyers in Italy and South America looked at the new prices and immediately switched to cheaper German coal. The British coal mine owners were thrown into a panic as they saw their order books empty out. They were already operating on razor-thin margins, and the sudden currency shift wiped out their entire profit. They were now losing significant money on every single ton of black gold they dug out of the ground. To survive this financial crisis, the owners saw only one option available to them. They had to reduce costs. They could not lower the fixed costs of machinery or transport, so they turned their eyes to the workers. They decided they had to ruthlessly reduce the cost of the men who risked their lives in the pits. On June 30th, 1925, the coal owners announced they were terminating the National Wage Agreement. They informed the miners that wages would be cut by up to 25% and workdays lengthened. The miners were outraged, as they were already among the poorest and most exploited workers in the nation. Their work was dangerous, dirty, and exhausting. Yet they were being asked to bear the brunt of national policy. They were told to work longer hours for starvation wages just so bankers in London could enjoy a strong currency. Union leader A.J. Cook coined the slogan that became the battle cry, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." The prediction made by Keynes had come true faster and more brutally than even he had imagined. The return to gold had effectively transferred the crushing cost of the national debt onto the shoulders of the working class. The strong pound was essentially a tax on the coal miners of Durham to subsidize the wine importers of Kensington. The government, realizing a massive strike was imminent and that they were unprepared, tried to buy some time. They offered a temporary subsidy to the mining industry to keep wages up, effectively buying 9 months of peace. It was nothing more than a flimsy band-aid applied desperately to a gushing bullet wound. During those 9 months of truce, both the government and the unions quietly prepared for total industrial war. The government established an emergency supply network to ensure the country could keep running without coal. Meanwhile, the unions organized a powerful triple alliance of miners, transport workers, and railwaymen pledging solidarity. Churchill, watching the gathering storm clouds, reportedly began to regret the advice he had taken from the experts. He realized he had been misled, but backing down now would be an admission of total failure. The deadline for the subsidy finally ran out in May 1926, and the truce was over. The mine owners refused to back down on wage cuts, and they immediately locked the miners out. On May 3, 1926, the solidarity of the unions held firm, and the call went out. The buses stopped running, the trains sat motionless on the tracks, and the busy docks fell silent. Even the printing presses of the great newspapers halted, signaling the start of the general strike. It was the largest industrial dispute in British history, with over 1.7 million workers walking off. The country was paralyzed, and to many terrified observers, it felt like the beginning of a revolution. At the heart of this chaos, invisible but unyielding, lay the golden chain strangling the economy. The general strike of May 1926 was the closest Britain ever came to a genuine socialist uprising. For 9 tense days, the machinery of the state stopped, and the silence in the factories was deafening. It was a supreme battle of wills between the organized working class and a government defending economic orthodoxy. But the government had a secret weapon that the unions had not fully anticipated: the middle class. Thousands of university students, stockbrokers, and retired officers volunteered to drive buses and unload ships. They saw themselves as the gallant defenders of the Constitution, standing firm against the anarchy of the mob. Winston Churchill, who had inadvertently triggered the crisis, was now in charge of the government's propaganda machine. He edited the British Gazette, treating the strike not as a dispute, but as an insurrection against the state. He wrote that if the conflict was fought to a conclusion, it would end in the overthrow of Parliament. The rhetoric worked, terrifying the leadership of the Trade Union Congress into believing they were drifting into treason. On May 12th, after just 9 days, the union leaders capitulated and called off the general strike. They surrendered without securing a single guarantee for the miners, a betrayal that would never be forgiven. The miners, abandoned and alone, refused to go back and stayed out for another 6 grueling months. They watched their children grow thin and burned their own floorboards for heat, but you cannot strike against arithmetic. By November, starvation forced them back down the pits to accept longer hours and lower wages. They had been utterly crushed by the golden straitjacket, and the city of London breathed a sigh of relief. The elite believed they had won, and that, with wages finally cut, the British economy would boom. But the boom never came. While the world partied, Britain sat sullenly in the corner. In the United States, the roaring 20s were exploding with cars, radios, and skyscrapers rising at dizzying speeds. Even France and Belgium, who had sensibly devalued their currencies, were seeing their industries recover and exports grow. Britain, however, was stuck in the mud, trapped by the fundamental problem of an overvalued currency. The wage cuts in the coal industry were simply not enough to compensate for the 10% handicap. To keep the pound pegged at 4.86, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates painfully high. If they lowered rates to help businesses expand, gold would immediately flow out of London to New York. So Montagu Norman kept his foot on the brake, choking off investment exactly when industry needed to modernize. The old industries continued their slow, painful death spiral, while unemployment stubbornly refused to drop below 1 million. Men in flat caps stood on street corners, the surplus people of an empire that had sacrificed them. The elite consoled themselves that this suffering was the price of credibility, believing they were playing the long game. But in October 1929, the game board was violently flipped over by the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression began, and the initial shockwaves hit an already fragile Britain with tremendous force. American loans dried up instantly, and as global demand plummeted, British export industries were decimated. Unemployment surged terrifyingly, jumping from 1 million to 2.5 million by 1930. In the summer of 1931, a financial plague spread across Europe, moving from Austria to Germany. London banks, having lent heavily to Germany, found those assets frozen while they still owed money to France. The City of London, the banker to the world, was suddenly caught in a deadly liquidity trap. Foreign investors, checking the books, realized the Bank of England lacked enough gold to cover its liabilities. In July 1931, the run on the pound began as millions in gold were withdrawn daily. Governor Montague Norman, overwhelmed by the stress, suffered a nervous breakdown and fled to Canada to recover. The Labour government faced a cruel ultimatum from New York bankers to cut unemployment benefits to secure loans. Refusing to betray the working class, the government collapsed, leading to the formation of a national government. This new coalition slashed wages for public servants, including teachers, police officers, and the Royal Navy. On September 15th, sailors of the Atlantic Fleet at Invergordon refused to work in a polite mutiny. News that the British government could not control its own navy sent a massive shockwave through global markets. The run on the pound turned into a stampede, draining the Bank of England's remaining gold reserves in days. On September 20th, 1931, the government finally admitted defeat and suspended the gold standard. The elite braced for the apocalypse, expecting riots and ruin. But Monday morning arrived without the sky falling. The pound dropped to $3.40, ironically the exact level it had held in 1919. But instead of disaster, the economy immediately began to breathe again as British goods became competitive worldwide. Cheap money flooded the South, sparking a housing boom and fueling new industries like aviation and automobiles. Yet, for the industrial North, the Depression never ended, creating a bitter divide of two distinct Britain. In 1936, the Jarrow Crusade saw ghost-like men march 300 miles to London begging for work. They were the living casualties of the gold standard, ignored by a government that refused to see them. This deep bitterness fueled the rise of extremism, with Oswald Mosley's blackshirts recruiting in the shattered heartlands. Financially humbled, the empire retreated behind a wall of tariffs, abandoning the free trade it had once championed. The disaster was the ultimate vindication of John Maynard Keynes, whose theories would revolutionize global economics. He proved that economies do not fix themselves and that governments must prioritize employment over currency value. But the lesson was learned too late, for the storm clouds of war were gathering over Europe again. When Britain faced Hitler in 1939, it did so with a hollowed-out industrial base and empty coffers. To pay for the war, Britain had to liquidate its remaining wealth, handing over bases and gold to America. The very gold Churchill had sacrificed his people to protect was shipped to Fort Knox to buy survival. The story of the Golden Straitjacket is a tragedy of patriots who confused the map with the territory. They believed the strength of a nation lay in the value of its coins rather than the productivity of its people. By sacrificing the real economy to save the financial one, they ultimately succeeded in losing both. It serves as a stark reminder that an economy exists to serve society, not to satisfy a ledger. As the pound severed its link to gold, the Pax Britannica ended, and the American century truly began.